Tonight's story comes from Maria, who thought she had finally found her soulmate after years of loneliness and heartbreak. Maria, a 52-year-old librarian from Denver, had been divorced for 8 years and was cautiously optimistic about love again. She joined several dating apps, but hadn't had much luck until she received a message from someone calling himself Captain James Mitchell, a handsome Army doctor stationed overseas. His profile showed a distinguished man in military uniform with kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately caught her attention. James reached out with a thoughtful message about her love of classic literature, mentioning he'd noticed her photo at the local library fundraiser. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her, asking about her favorite books and sharing stories about his medical work helping wounded soldiers. Over the next few weeks, their conversations grew deeper and more personal. He told her about losing his wife to cancer 3 years earlier and how lonely military life could be. Maria found herself looking forward to his messages every day, feeling a connection she hadn't experienced in years. What made James seem so legitimate was his incredible attention to detail and consistency. He sent her photos of himself in various locations, always in military fatigues or medical scrubs. He knew intimate details about military life and medical procedures that seemed impossible to fake. James would call her at specific times, explaining that his schedule was dictated by his duties at the base hospital. He even sent her a military email address and gave her a phone number that he said was his direct line at the base. When she looked up his name online, she found what appeared to be military records and even a few news articles mentioning a Dr. James Mitchell who had received commendations for his service. The relationship progressed beautifully for 2 months, with daily phone calls and constant text messages. James shared intimate details about his life, his fears, his dreams of retiring from the military and settling down. He sent her flowers on her birthday with a card signed, "All my love, James." He talked about visiting her as soon as his deployment ended, painting vivid pictures of their future together. However, small inconsistencies began to emerge that made her uncomfortable. Sometimes he would mention being in Afghanistan, other times Syria. His stories about the base hospital didn't always align with previous conversations. Everything changed during a late-night phone call when James broke down crying, telling Maria about a terrible accident at the base hospital. He explained that he had been treating wounded soldiers when an explosion damaged the medical facility and several patients needed immediate evacuation to a better-equipped hospital in Germany. He said he needed to accompany them but didn't have the funds to cover the emergency travel expenses because his military pay was tied up in red tape. Through tears, he begged Maria to wire him $3,000 to help save these soldiers' lives, promising to pay her back as soon as his military pay was released. Against her better judgment, she agreed to send the money. The moment Maria sent the wire transfer, James's entire demeanor changed. What had been loving, patient conversations became urgent demands for more money. He claimed the situation had worsened and he needed another $5,000 for medical supplies. When Maria hesitated, he became angry and manipulative, saying she obviously didn't care about him or the dying soldiers. Maria realized with growing horror that she had been completely deceived. She contacted the real military base and learned that no Dr. James Mitchell was serving there. The photos, emails, and entire relationship had been an elaborate lie designed to steal her money and break her heart. Maria immediately contacted her bank and reported the fraud to the FBI. She discovered that the real James Mitchell was actually a retired dentist from Ohio whose photos had been stolen and used in dozens of romance scams. The man she had been talking to was likely part of an international criminal organization operating from West Africa. Maria worked with investigators to provide evidence, including all their communications and financial records. While she never recovered the $8,000 she lost, she found healing through helping others avoid similar scams. She learned to trust her instincts again and eventually did find love with a local man she met through friends. The experience taught her that real love doesn't come with urgent financial demands or pressure to act against your better judgment. Meet David, a 67-year-old retired auto mechanic who never expected that his late wife's encouragement to find someone new would lead him into the most expensive mistake of his life. David had been alone for 2 years since his beloved wife Margaret passed away from lung cancer, and his grown children worried about his increasing isolation. His daughter Sarah had helped him set up a profile on a senior dating site, hoping he might find companionship in his golden years. He was hesitant at first, But the loneliness was becoming unbearable, especially during the long winter evenings in his empty house in small-town Minnesota. That's when he received a message from Linda Chun, who claimed to be a 58-year-old widow from San Francisco. Her profile photos showed an attractive Asian woman with a warm smile, and her opening message mentioned how much she admired his honesty about missing his late wife. Linda shared that she too had lost her spouse to cancer and understood the pain of starting over. Their early conversations were gentle and healing, focusing on their shared experiences of loss and their hopes for the future. David found comfort in talking to someone who seemed to understand his grief so deeply. Linda's approach was masterfully crafted to appeal to David's specific vulnerabilities. She never rushed the relationship, instead taking weeks to build emotional intimacy before ever mentioning anything about money. She sent him pictures of herself at various locations around San Francisco, claiming to work as a nurse at a prestigious hospital. Linda shared stories about her late husband, her grown son studying abroad, and her love of gardening and cooking. She even sent David recipes for traditional Chinese dishes, encouraging him to try cooking again after months of eating frozen dinners. After 3 months of daily conversations, Linda began sharing concerns about her son Kevin, who was supposedly studying medicine at a university in London. She explained that Kevin was brilliant but had gotten into financial trouble when his student loan was delayed due to paperwork issues. The university was threatening to expel him just months before graduation unless he could pay his outstanding tuition balance. Linda said she had been saving money to visit David in Minnesota, but now she faced an impossible choice between helping her son and pursuing their relationship. She never directly asked David for money, instead expressing how heartbroken she was about potentially losing both her son's future and her chance at happiness. David's protective instincts kicked in immediately. He had always been a problem solver, and the thought of Linda suffering while he had money sitting in his retirement account seemed wrong. When he offered to help, Linda initially refused, saying she couldn't accept money from someone she hadn't met in person. This seeming reluctance made David even more determined to help. He insisted on wiring $15,000 to cover Kevin's tuition, telling Linda it was a loan that she could repay when her finances improved. The requests for money quickly escalated after that first payment. Kevin supposedly needed money for medical textbooks, then for a research project, then for living expenses when his part-time job fell through. Linda herself claimed to need money for her mother's sudden medical emergency, then for repairs to her home after a kitchen fire. Each request came with elaborate explanations, forged documents, and emotional appeals. David found himself wiring money weekly, sometimes daily, totaling over $85,000 in just 2 months. The breaking point came when Linda claimed she needed $25,000 for a plane ticket to visit him, but the money had to be sent to Malaysia. David's son Michael became suspicious when his father mentioned sending money to Malaysia and decided to investigate. Michael reverse-searched Linda's photos and discovered they belonged to a Malaysian actress who had nothing to do with any romance scam. When confronted with this evidence, David initially refused to believe it, so invested was he in the relationship. Michael contacted the FBI and local police, who confirmed that David had been victimized by a sophisticated romance scam likely operating from Southeast Asia. The emotional devastation of learning that Linda, Kevin, and their entire relationship had been fictional was almost worse than the financial loss. David never recovered any of his lost retirement savings, forcing him to significantly downsize his lifestyle and rely more heavily on Social Security. However, he channeled his anger into becoming an advocate for elder fraud prevention, speaking at community centers and sharing his story to help others avoid similar scams. He learned that the shame belonged to the criminals, not the victims, and that his capacity for love and generosity, while exploited, remained his greatest strengths. This is about Jennifer, who never thought answering her phone would lead to a 2-year nightmare that would cost her both her heart and her life savings. Jennifer, a 41-year-old single mother working as a dental hygienist in Phoenix, had been focused on raising her teenage daughter and building a stable life after a difficult divorce. She wasn't actively looking for romance, but she also wasn't opposed to it if the right person came along. Her friends had been encouraging her to start dating again, but between work and parenting, she barely had time for herself, let alone a relationship. The call came on a Tuesday evening while she was helping her daughter with homework. The man on the other end had a slight accent and apologized for the wrong number, saying he had been trying to reach his cousin in Phoenix. Instead of hanging up, they began chatting, and Jennifer found herself laughing for the first time in months. He introduced himself as Dr. Alexander Petrov, a widowed surgeon originally from Russia who now worked with Doctors Without Borders. Alex explained that he had been trying to reach his cousin to arrange a visit during his brief time between assignments. Over the following weeks, Alex proved to be everything Jennifer had hoped to find in a partner. He was intelligent, cultured, and deeply committed to helping others through his medical work. He shared stories about performing life-saving surgeries in refugee camps and remote villages, painting himself as a humanitarian hero. Alex sent her photos of himself in medical scrubs working in various international locations, and his knowledge of medical procedures and global health issues seemed genuine and extensive. He spoke fluent English with what sounded like an authentic Russian accent, and he could discuss literature, art, and world events with remarkable depth. What made Alex's story so convincing was his apparent reluctance to ask for any kind of help or support. He insisted on paying for their international phone calls and even sent Jennifer flowers and gifts through online services. He talked about his comfortable life as a surgeon and his plans to eventually settle down somewhere peaceful with the right woman. Alex shared intimate details about losing his wife to cancer and how lonely his life had become despite his important work. He made Jennifer feel special and chosen, telling her that she had brought light back into his dark world. 6 months into their relationship, Alex's situation suddenly changed when he contacted Jennifer in distress from what he claimed was a dangerous assignment in Syria. He explained that rebels had attacked the medical facility where he was working, and several doctors had been kidnapped. Alex said he was hiding in a safe house but needed money to pay for protection and secure transportation out of the country. He claimed his bank accounts had been frozen due to the political situation, and he had no way to access his own funds. Through tears, he begged Jennifer to wire him $5,000 to help save his life, promising to repay her as soon as he reached safety. The rescue turned into an ongoing crisis that required constant financial support. Alex claimed he was being moved from one safe house to another, each requiring payment to the people helping him. He needed money for food, medical supplies for injured colleagues, bribes for corrupt officials, and transportation costs. Jennifer maxed out her credit cards and took out a second mortgage on her home to support the man she loved. She sent over $150,000 over the course of 8 months, believing she was literally saving Alex's life. Jennifer's world collapsed when her brother, a police officer, decided to investigate Alex's claims and discovered that the photos he had been sending were stolen from a real doctor's social media profiles. The man in the photos was Dr. Marcus Webb, a pediatric surgeon from Atlanta who had never been to Syria and had no idea his identity was being used in romance scams. When Jennifer confronted Alex with this evidence, he claimed that Dr. Webb was actually him using a fake name for security reasons, but his story became increasingly convoluted and impossible to believe. Jennifer had to declare bankruptcy and move to a smaller apartment, fundamentally changing her and her daughter's lifestyle. However, she used her experience to help other romance scam victims through online support groups and worked with law enforcement to educate others about these sophisticated schemes. She learned that the criminals had weaponized her capacity for love and compassion, but she refused to let them destroy her ability to trust and care for others. Robert's nightmare began when he received an official-looking letter claiming to be from a law firm representing Publishers Clearing House, informing him that he had won $2.5 million in their international sweepstakes. Robert, a 73-year-old retired postal worker from rural Kansas, had indeed entered several sweepstakes over the years, hoping to supplement his modest retirement income. The letter looked completely legitimate, printed on expensive letterhead with official seals and signatures. It explained that he had been selected as a winner, but needed to pay processing fees and taxes before his prize could be released. When Robert called the number provided, he was connected to a woman who introduced herself as Michelle Carter, a claims processor for the law firm. Michelle sounded professional and knowledgeable, walking Robert through the prize claim process step by step. She explained that while his winnings were guaranteed, federal law required all taxes and processing fees to be paid up front before any prize money could be distributed. Michelle cited specific tax codes and regulations that sounded authentic, and she provided Robert with a case number and official forms to fill out. Michelle's approach was perfectly calibrated to appeal to Robert's trusting nature and his desire for financial security. She never pressured him to send money immediately, instead encouraging him to take time to review all the documentation and ask questions. She sent him additional official-looking paperwork, including what appeared to be government tax forms and bank verification documents. Michel explained that his prize was being held in an escrow account and provided him with account numbers that seemed to confirm the legitimacy of his winnings. Over the course of several weeks, Robert sent increasingly large amounts of money to cover various fees and taxes associated with his prize claim. First, he sent $1,200 for processing fees, then $3,500 for federal taxes, followed by $2,800 for state taxes. Each payment was followed by official-looking receipts and updated documentation showing his case progressing through the system. Michel regularly called to update Robert on his case status and to request additional fees for unexpected complications, insurance bonds, courier services, and international transfer fees. The scam's sophisticated presentation began to unravel when Robert's daughter, Susan, became suspicious about the frequent requests for money. She researched the law firm online and discovered that while a firm with that name did exist, they had never heard of Michelle Carter or any sweepstakes claims processing. Susan also contacted Publishers Clearinghouse directly and learned that they never require winners to pay fees up front, and they don't work with external law firms to process prizes. Confronted with irrefutable evidence that he had been scammed, Robert experienced a devastating combination of financial loss and emotional trauma. He had not only lost his life savings but had also borrowed money from his children under false pretenses, damaging family relationships and his own sense of dignity. Robert never recovered any of the money he sent and was forced to rely on his children for financial support in his final years. Despite the devastating impact on his life, Robert became determined to prevent others from falling victim to similar scams, working with local senior centers and law enforcement to share his story and educate other elderly residents about sweepstakes fraud. When Sandra received a call about her granddaughter being in jail, her grandmother's instincts kicked in immediately, overriding any rational thought about verifying the emergency. Sandra, a 69-year-old retired nurse from Tampa, had always been the family problem solver, the one everyone called when they needed help or support. Her 19-year-old granddaughter Emma was away at college in North Carolina, and while she was generally responsible, Sandra knew that college students sometimes made mistakes. When the frantic call came at 6 a.m. claiming that Emma had been arrested for drunk driving and needed bail money immediately, Sandra's protective instincts took over completely. The caller, who identified himself as Detective Martinez with the Charlotte Police Department, sounded official and professional. He provided specific details about the arrest, including the exact charges, the bail amount of $3,500, and the location where Emma was being held. Detective Martinez explained that Emma was embarrassed and scared, and had specifically asked that only her grandmother be contacted. He said Emma was afraid to call her parents because she didn't want to disappoint them, but she trusted Sandra to help her without judgment. What made this scam particularly effective was the sense of urgency and the emotional manipulation involved. Detective Martinez explained that Emma needed to be bailed out within a few hours or she would be transferred to a county facility where she could be held for weeks before getting a court date. He painted a terrifying picture of what could happen to a young college student in jail, emphasizing the danger she faced and the time-sensitive nature of the situation. When Sandra asked to speak to Emma directly, the detective explained that she was still being processed and couldn't take calls. Sandra immediately drove to her bank and withdrew $3,500 from her savings account, then went to a nearby Western Union location to wire the money as instructed. The detective had provided specific instructions about how to send the money and who to send it to, claiming that bail payments had to be processed through a special bonding company that worked with the police department. Sandra followed every instruction exactly, motivated by her love for Emma and her terror about what might happen if she didn't act quickly. Hours passed without any word from Emma, and Sandra began to worry that something had gone wrong with the bail process. When she called the number Detective Martinez had given her, it went straight to voicemail. Growing increasingly anxious, Sandra decided to call Emma directly at her dorm room and was shocked when Emma answered the phone, clearly safe and completely unaware of any arrest or legal trouble. The realization that she had been scammed hit Sandra like a physical blow. Sandra immediately contacted her local police and the FBI to report the grandparent scam, learning that this type of fraud had become increasingly common and sophisticated. The scammers had likely gathered information about Emma from social media profiles and public records, then used that information to make their story believable. The $3,500 loss was significant for Sandra on her fixed retirement income, but the emotional impact was even worse. However, Sandra channeled her anger into action, working with local police to educate other grandparents about this type of fraud, emphasizing that scammers prey on our deepest love for our families. Here's what happened to Michael after he decided to help a beautiful woman he met online who claimed to be trapped in a dangerous situation overseas. Michael, a 55-year-old divorced construction foreman from Detroit, had been lonely since his marriage ended 3 years earlier. His ex-wife had taken most of their friends in the divorce, and his demanding work schedule left little time for socializing. When his coworkers suggested he try online dating, Michael was skeptical but eventually created a profile on a popular dating website, hoping to find someone to share his life with. That's when he connected with Svetlana Petrov, who claimed to be a 38-year-old English teacher from Ukraine. Her profile photos showed a stunningly beautiful blonde woman with kind eyes and an elegant smile. Svetlana's messages were thoughtful and well-written, showing genuine interest in Michael's work and his life in America. She shared that she had been widowed young when her husband died in a car accident, leaving her to raise their young daughter alone. Svetlana painted a picture of a simple but fulfilling life teaching English to children in a small Ukrainian town. Their relationship developed slowly over several months, with daily emails and weekly phone calls. Svetlana's English was excellent, though she spoke with a charming accent that made her seem even more exotic and appealing. She sent Michael photos of herself and her daughter, pictures of her classroom, and images of her small apartment in the beautiful Ukrainian countryside. Svetlana was patient and understanding about Michael's past relationship troubles, offering comfort and support when he shared his struggles with divorce and loneliness. The crisis began when Svetlana contacted Michael in panic, explaining that political tensions in Ukraine had escalated and her town was becoming dangerous. She claimed that foreign teachers were being targeted and that she needed to leave the country immediately with her daughter to ensure their safety. Svetlana had been offered a teaching position in London, but she needed money for plane tickets and travel documents. She was too proud to ask for help initially, but when Michael offered to assist, she gratefully accepted his offer to wire $2,000 for their travel expenses. The travel became a series of increasingly expensive complications. First, Svetlana needed additional money because her daughter required special medical clearance to travel. Then their flight was canceled and they had to pay premium prices for new tickets. At the London airport, they were detained by immigration officials who demanded proof of financial support before allowing them to enter the country. Each crisis required Michael to send more money, and each time Svetlana expressed overwhelming gratitude and promised that this would be the last time she needed help. The deception began to unravel when Michael demanded to video chat with Svetlana before sending any more money. She claimed her phone was broken and she couldn't afford to replace it, but she could borrow a friend's phone for a brief call. When the video call finally happened, the woman on screen looked different from the photos Svetlana had been sending, and she seemed nervous and uncomfortable. When Michael questioned the discrepancies, she claimed she had been injured in the political violence. Michael hired a private investigator who quickly discovered that the photos Svetlana had been sending were stolen from a Russian model's social media accounts. The woman had never been to Ukraine, had no daughter, and had no idea her images were being used in romance scams. Michael realized that he had been communicating with professional scammers who had studied his profile and tailored their approach to exploit his specific vulnerabilities. He never recovered any of the $25,000 he lost and was forced to work additional years before retirement to rebuild his savings. Thomas thought his late-night loneliness was finally over when he connected with Anna, a woman who seemed to understand his deepest emotions and desires. Thomas, a 48-year-old widowed accountant from Portland, had been struggling with depression and isolation since his wife died from breast cancer 2 years earlier. His grief had consumed him, making it difficult to connect with friends and family who wanted to help but couldn't truly understand his pain. Late one evening, while browsing social media, he received a friend request from Anna Kowalski, a beautiful woman who claimed to be a 42-year-old nurse from Poland working with a medical charity in Syria. Anna's approach was unlike anything Thomas had experienced before. Instead of typical small talk, she immediately demonstrated a deep understanding of loss and grief, sharing that she too had lost her husband to cancer and knew the unique pain of watching someone you love slowly slip away. Her messages were poetic and emotionally intelligent, touching on themes of healing, hope, and the possibility of finding love again after tragedy. Anna sent Thomas beautiful photos of herself in various locations, always professionally dressed and radiating warmth and compassion. What made Anna's story so compelling was her apparent reluctance to burden Thomas with her own problems. She focused entirely on his healing process, encouraging him to talk about his late wife and his struggles with moving forward. Anna shared wisdom about grief that seemed to come from genuine experience, helping Thomas feel understood for the first time since his wife's death. She sent him inspirational quotes, poems about healing, and photos of the children she was helping in Syria. Anna never asked for anything from Thomas, instead seeming to give constantly of her time, attention, and emotional support. 6 months into their relationship, Anna's situation in Syria became increasingly dangerous. She began sharing stories about the medical facility where she worked coming under attack from rebel forces. Anna sent Thomas photos of damaged buildings and wounded children, explaining that the charity she worked for was running out of money and might have to close the clinic. She expressed heartbreak about potentially having to abandon the children who depended on her medical care. When Thomas offered to help financially, Anna initially refused, saying she couldn't accept money from someone she cared about. The needs of Anna's medical mission escalated quickly after that initial donation. The clinic needed emergency medical supplies, evacuations for critically injured children, and security protection for the medical staff. Anna sent Thomas increasingly desperate messages about specific children who would die without immediate medical intervention, complete with photos and medical charts that looked authentic. She never directly asked for money, instead expressing her heartbreak about not being able to save these innocent victims of war. Thomas felt compelled to help, sending increasingly large amounts of money to support Anna's life-saving work. Thomas began to question Anna's story when she claimed she needed money to pay ransom for kidnapped medical volunteers, including herself. The story had become so extreme and the demands so large that Thomas finally started researching Anna's supposed medical charity online. He discovered that while organizations with similar names existed, none of them had any record of Anna Kowalski or the specific clinic she claimed to work for. When Thomas reverse-searched Anna's photos, he discovered they belonged to a Polish fitness influencer who had never worked in medicine or been to Syria. Thomas contacted federal authorities and learned that his case was part of a sophisticated romance scam operation that specifically targeted widowed and divorced individuals by exploiting their grief and desire to help others. The money he sent had been moved through multiple international accounts and was unrecoverable. Thomas had to declare bankruptcy and lost his home, but with the help of therapy and support groups for romance scam victims, he learned that his capacity for love and generosity, while exploited, remained his greatest strengths. Let me tell you about Patricia, who discovered that her search for companionship in her golden years would lead to the most expensive and heartbreaking mistake of her life. Patricia, a 74-year-old retired elementary school principal from Tucson, had been widowed for 5 years and was finally ready to consider dating again. Her late husband had been her high school sweetheart, and she had never really learned how to meet new people outside of work and church. When her granddaughter helped her set up a profile on a senior dating website, Patricia was nervous but excited about the possibility of finding someone to share her remaining years with. Within days of creating her profile, Patricia received a message from William Harrison, who claimed to be a 68-year-old retired engineer from California. His profile showed a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes, and his initial message was thoughtful and respectful. William shared that he too had lost his spouse and understood how difficult it was to start over later in life. He was impressed by Patricia's career as an educator and shared stories about his own work designing bridges and buildings throughout his career. William's approach was perfectly calibrated to appeal to Patricia's values and life experience. He was a gentleman in every sense, always respectful and interested in her opinions and experiences. William shared stories about his late wife, his grown children who lived far away, and his comfortable retirement funded by his successful engineering career. He sent Patricia flowers for her birthday and small gifts that showed he was paying attention to their conversations. William talked about his love of travel and his dream of taking a special woman on a Mediterranean cruise. 3 months into their relationship, William's comfortable retirement was suddenly threatened when he claimed to have been contacted by lawyers representing a construction company that was suing him over a bridge project from decades earlier. William explained that the company was claiming the bridge had structural defects that caused an accident, and they were seeking millions in damages. While William insisted he had done nothing wrong, he needed money for legal fees to fight the lawsuit. His retirement accounts were frozen pending the litigation, and he couldn't access his funds to pay his attorneys. Patricia's protective instincts kicked in immediately. She had always been someone who helped others in crisis, and the thought of William facing this legal battle alone was unbearable. When she offered to help with his legal expenses, William initially refused, saying he couldn't accept money from someone he cared about. His apparent reluctance made Patricia even more determined to help, and she insisted on wiring him $8,000 to help with attorney fees. The legal crisis escalated quickly, with William needing money for expert witnesses, court filing fees, and additional attorney consultations. Patricia's world collapsed when she discovered that William's photos belonged to a real retired engineer from Arizona who had no idea his identity was being used in romance scams. The sophisticated legal documents were forgeries, and the phone number William had given her was registered to a calling service that masked the caller's true location. Patricia realized she had been communicating with professional scammers who had studied her profile and crafted William's persona to exploit her specific vulnerabilities as a widowed educator with a comfortable retirement savings. Patricia worked with federal investigators to provide evidence of the scam, but the money had been quickly moved through international accounts and was unrecoverable. The loss of $45,000 significantly impacted her retirement lifestyle, forcing her to cancel travel plans and reduce her charitable giving. However, Patricia channeled her anger into helping other seniors avoid romance scams, speaking at community centers, and working with law enforcement to educate others. You won't believe what happened to Rebecca when she thought she had found the perfect man who shared her passion for helping others and building a better world. Rebecca, a 35-year-old social worker from Seattle, had always been drawn to people who wanted to make a difference in the world. After ending a long-term relationship with someone who didn't share her values, she was looking for a partner who understood her commitment to social justice and humanitarian work. When she joined an online dating platform specifically designed for socially conscious professionals, she hoped to find someone who shared her passion for helping others. That's when she connected with Marcus Thompson, who claimed to be a 39-year-old humanitarian aid worker based in Ghana. His profile was filled with photos of him working with children in various African countries, building wells, distributing food, and providing medical care to underserved communities. Marcus described himself as someone who had left a lucrative career in international finance to dedicate his life to humanitarian work. His messages to Rebecca were thoughtful and inspiring, sharing stories about the communities he served and his philosophy about making a positive impact in the world. Marcus's approach was sophisticated and perfectly tailored to Rebecca's values and interests. He shared detailed stories about his work with various international NGOs, providing specific examples of projects he had completed and lives he had helped transform. Marcus sent Rebecca photos from his humanitarian missions, showing him with grateful families, newly constructed schools, and medical clinics he claimed to have helped establish. He discussed complex international development issues with apparent expertise, and he seemed genuinely committed to the causes Rebecca cared about most. What made Marcus so believable was his apparent financial independence and his reluctance to discuss money. He claimed to have invested wisely during his finance career and said he was fortunate to be able to fund his humanitarian work without worrying about personal finances. Marcus never asked Rebecca for money, instead focusing their conversations on shared values and their mutual desire to make the world a better place. He talked about eventually returning to the United States and finding a partner who could join him in his mission to help others. 6 months into their relationship, Marcus contacted Rebecca in crisis from a remote village in Ghana where he was working on a clean water project. He explained that the local government had suddenly imposed new regulations requiring foreign aid workers to pay substantial fees to continue their humanitarian work. Marcus was devastated because he had promised the village that their new well would be completed, but he was short of the required fees by $12,000. He had already invested his own money in the project and couldn't bear to abandon the families who were counting on clean water for their children. Rebecca insisted on helping, viewing it not as giving money to Marcus personally, but as contributing to a humanitarian cause she believed in. She wired $12,000 to complete the water project, feeling proud to be part of something that would genuinely help people in need. However, the project encountered additional complications that required more funding. The well drilling hit unexpected rock formations, requiring specialized equipment. Local officials demanded additional permits and fees, Each crisis was accompanied by photos of disappointed villagers and detailed explanations of the technical challenges involved. The deception began to unravel when Rebecca asked Marcus to arrange a video call with some of the villagers who had benefited from the water project she had helped fund. Marcus provided various excuses about poor internet connectivity and cultural sensitivities, but he couldn't produce any evidence that the projects actually existed. When Rebecca hired a private investigator to verify Marcus's claims, she discovered that his photos had been stolen from various humanitarian organizations' websites and social media accounts. The real people in the photos had never heard of Marcus Thompson, and none of the projects he claimed to be working on existed. Rebecca never got back the $85,000 she lost, which represented most of her savings for a future home purchase. However, she used her experience to help other romance scam victims and to educate socially conscious individuals about how their altruistic impulses could be exploited by criminals. She learned that her desire to help others, while manipulated, remained her greatest strength, and she continued her social work career with renewed awareness. Catherine's nightmare began when she met what she thought was the man of her dreams on a Christian dating website. Catherine, a 58-year-old widow from Nashville, had been alone for 3 years since her husband died in a car accident. As a devout Christian, she was looking for someone who shared her faith and values. When she received a message from Pastor Jonathan Rivers, who claimed to be a missionary working in West Africa, she felt like her prayers had been answered. His profile showed a handsome man in his early 60s with kind eyes and a gentle smile, always photographed helping children or building churches in remote villages. Jonathan's messages were filled with scripture and spiritual wisdom that resonated deeply with Catherine's faith. He shared stories about his missionary work, bringing the gospel to remote villages and building schools and medical clinics for underserved communities. Jonathan spoke about his calling from God to serve others and his dream of finding a godly woman to share his ministry. He quoted Bible verses about love and partnership, making Catherine feel like their meeting was divinely orchestrated. Their conversations often turned to discussions about faith, service, and their shared desire to make a difference in the world. What made Jonathan seem so authentic was his apparent reluctance to talk about money or personal needs. He focused their conversations on spiritual matters and his missionary work, always deflecting when Catherine asked about his personal circumstances. Jonathan sent her photos of himself with African children, building churches, and distributing food to hungry families. He shared detailed stories about the villages he served and the lives he had touched through his ministry. Catherine felt drawn to his dedication and his apparent closeness to God. 6 months into their relationship, Jonathan contacted Catherine in distress from a remote village in Nigeria. He explained that he had been working to build a new church and school when armed militants attacked the area, destroying much of their work and stealing the funds designated for the project. Jonathan was heartbroken because he had promised the village that their church would be completed before the rainy season, and now he was short $15,000 to finish the construction. He said he had been praying for a solution when God laid it on his heart to reach out to Catherine for help. Catherine felt called by God to help Jonathan complete his missionary work. She viewed it not as giving money to Jonathan personally, but as supporting God's work in Africa. She wired $15,000 to help rebuild the church, feeling blessed to be part of something that would spread the gospel to remote villages. However, new crises kept arising. The militants returned and destroyed the medical supplies meant for the clinic. Local officials demanded bribes to allow the construction to continue. Jonathan needed money for security guards to protect the workers and the children who attended the school. Each request for money came with heart-wrenching stories about the suffering villagers and biblical justifications for why Catherine should help. Jonathan quoted scripture about helping those in need and reminded Catherine that God would bless her generosity tenfold. Over 8 months, Catherine sent over $75,000, liquidating her husband's life insurance policy and borrowing against her home to support what she believed was God's work through Jonathan's ministry. The deception began to unravel when Catherine asked Jonathan to arrange for her to speak with some of the villagers he was helping, wanting to hear firsthand about the impact of her contributions. Jonathan provided various excuses about language barriers and poor communication infrastructure, but he couldn't produce any evidence that his missionary work actually existed. When Catherine contacted the Christian organization Jonathan claimed to work with, they had never heard of him. She discovered that his photos had been stolen from a real missionary's website, and the stories about building churches and schools were completely fabricated. Catherine realized that her faith had been weaponized against her by criminals who understood exactly how to manipulate religious people. The betrayal felt like a crisis of faith as much as a financial disaster. She had to take out a second mortgage on her home and face the possibility of losing everything she and her husband had worked for. However, Catherine found strength in her church community and used her experience to warn other Christians about religious romance scams. She learned that even her faith-based generosity could be exploited, but she refused to let criminals destroy her relationship with God. Brian's story begins when he thought he'd found someone who understood his struggle with being a single father. Brian, a 42-year-old divorced paramedic from Chicago, had been raising his 8-year-old son alone since his ex-wife left them for another man. Working long shifts and caring for his son left little time for dating, but he was lonely and hoped to find someone who could accept both him and his child. When he joined a dating app for single parents, he was cautious but hopeful about finding a genuine connection with someone who understood the challenges of single parenthood. That's when he met Isabella Rodriguez, who claimed to be a 36-year-old single mother from Mexico City working as a nurse while raising her 10-year-old daughter alone. Her profile photos showed a beautiful woman with warm eyes and a bright smile, often pictured with her daughter at parks and family events. Isabella's messages were thoughtful and understanding, sharing her own struggles with balancing work and motherhood. She talked about the challenges of dating as a single parent and how difficult it was to find someone who would accept her daughter as part of the package. Isabella's approach was perfectly designed to appeal to Brian's experiences as a single father. She shared stories about her daughter's school activities, her struggles with childcare, and her dreams of providing a better life for her child. Isabella spoke about wanting to move to the United States to give her daughter better educational opportunities, but said she was saving money and learning English to make the transition. She sent Brian photos of herself and her daughter, pictures of her workplace at the hospital, and images of their modest but loving home in Mexico City. Their relationship developed over months of daily conversations about parenting, their children's milestones, and their shared dreams of finding love while putting their children first. Isabella was patient and understanding when Brian had to cancel video calls due to his son's needs or work emergencies. She shared parenting advice and seemed genuinely interested in Brian's son's activities and school performance. Isabella made Brian feel like she truly understood the complexities of single parenthood and would welcome both him and his son into her life. The crisis began when Isabella contacted Brian in panic, explaining that her daughter had been diagnosed with a serious heart condition that required immediate surgery. Isabella was devastated because the surgery would cost $25,000 and her insurance wouldn't cover the full amount. She had some savings, but was still short $8,000 for the surgery that could save her daughter's life. Isabella was too proud to ask for help directly, but Brian could hear her crying during their phone conversations as she talked about the possibility of losing her child. Brian's protective instincts as a father kicked in immediately. He couldn't bear the thought of a child dying when he had the power to help, and he offered to send Isabella the money she needed for her daughter's surgery. Isabella initially refused, saying she couldn't accept such a large amount from someone she hadn't met in person, but Brian insisted. He wired $8,000 to help save what he believed was an innocent child's life, viewing it as one parent helping another in a time of desperate need. The medical crisis escalated quickly after the surgery. Isabella's daughter developed complications that required additional procedures and extended hospital stays. The hospital demanded payment for specialized medications, private nursing care, and advanced medical equipment. Each request came with medical documents that appeared authentic and heart-wrenching updates about the child's condition. Brian sent increasingly large amounts of money, totaling over $45,000 over 4 months, borrowing against his own son's college fund to help what he believed was a dying child. The deception began to unravel when Brian asked Isabella to video chat so he could see her daughter and check on her recovery. Isabella provided various excuses about the child being too weak to talk or the hospital having strict visiting policies, but she couldn't produce any evidence that her daughter actually existed. When Brian hired a translator to call the hospital Isabella claimed to be using, they had no record of any patient matching her daughter's description. He discovered that Isabella's photos had been stolen from a Mexican actress's social media accounts, and the medical documents were sophisticated forgeries. Brian realized that his love for his own son had been used against him to manipulate his parental instincts. The criminals had studied his profile as a single father and created a scenario they knew would compel him to help. He never recovered the $45,000 he lost, which had been his son's college savings. Brian had to explain to his 8-year-old why they needed to move to a smaller apartment and why there might not be money for college. However, he used his experience to warn other single parents about these sophisticated scams that exploit parental love and the desire to help children in need. Nancy's journey into romance fraud began when she was at her most vulnerable, having just been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. Nancy, a 61-year-old retired teacher from Portland, was facing her diagnosis alone after her husband of 30 years had died from a heart attack just 18 months earlier. The combination of grief, fear, and isolation made her desperate for emotional support and companionship. When her doctor recommended online support groups for cancer patients, Nancy also decided to try senior dating websites, hoping to find someone who could provide comfort during her treatment journey. That's when she connected with Dr. Richard Sullivan, who claimed to be a 65-year-old oncologist from Boston who had recently lost his wife to the same type of cancer Nancy was fighting. His profile showed a distinguished gentleman in medical attire, and his messages demonstrated an intimate knowledge of cancer treatment that seemed impossible to fake. Richard shared his own experience of watching his beloved wife battle the disease and spoke about his dedication to helping other cancer patients through his medical practice and research work. Richard's approach was masterfully crafted to appeal to Nancy's specific fears and needs during her cancer journey. He offered medical advice about treatment options, shared encouraging stories about patients who had successfully beaten her type of cancer, and provided emotional support during her chemotherapy sessions. Richard would call Nancy before and after her treatments, offering comfort and reassurance when she felt sick and frightened. He seemed to understand exactly what she was going through, both as a cancer patient and as someone who had lost a spouse. What made Richard seem so legitimate was his apparent expertise in oncology and his reluctance to burden Nancy with his own problems. He focused entirely on her healing and emotional well-being, sending her inspirational books about cancer survivors, care packages with comfort items for her chemotherapy days, and flowers to brighten her spirits during treatment. Richard spoke about his comfortable life as a successful doctor and his plans to retire soon to focus on cancer research and spending time with someone special who understood the preciousness of life. 6 months into their relationship, Richard's situation suddenly changed when he contacted Nancy from what he claimed was a medical conference in London. He explained that he had been invited to present his cancer research at an international symposium, but a mix-up with the conference organizers had left him stranded without access to his funds. Richard's credit cards weren't working overseas, and he needed money for his hotel bill and flight home. He was embarrassed to ask for help, but he had no one else to turn to and promised to repay Nancy as soon as he returned to Boston. Nancy felt compelled to help the man who had supported her through her darkest days. She wired $3,000 to help Richard with his travel expenses, viewing it as repaying the kindness he had shown her during her cancer treatment. However, Richard's situation in London became increasingly complicated. He claimed that his research materials were stolen from his hotel room, and he needed money to recreate his presentation materials and extend his stay to present at additional conferences. The medical community was very interested in his cancer research, but he needed funding to continue his work. Each request for money came with detailed explanations about Richard's groundbreaking cancer research and how it could help save lives of patients like Nancy. He sent her what appeared to be medical journals featuring his research and invitations to prestigious medical conferences around the world. Nancy sent increasingly large amounts of money, totaling over $60,000 over 6 months, liquidating her cancer treatment fund and borrowing against her home to support what she believed was life-saving medical research. The deception began to unravel when Nancy asked Richard to provide her with copies of his published research so she could share it with her own oncologist. Richard provided various excuses about confidentiality agreements and pending patent applications, but he couldn't produce any evidence that his research actually existed. When Nancy contacted the medical school Richard claimed to be affiliated with, they had never heard of him. She discovered that his photos had been stolen from a real doctor's website, and the medical journals he had sent her were sophisticated forgeries. Nancy realized that her cancer diagnosis had been used against her by criminals who understood exactly how to exploit the fear and vulnerability of someone facing a life-threatening illness. The betrayal was devastating, coming at a time when she was already fighting for her life and struggling with the loss of her husband. She had to delay some of her cancer treatments due to financial constraints and faced the possibility of losing her home. However, Nancy found strength in her cancer support group and used her experience to warn other cancer patients about medical romance scams that prey on people's desperation for hope and healing. Mark's introduction to romance fraud came during one of the most difficult periods of his life, while he was caring for his elderly mother with Alzheimer's disease. Mark, a 54-year-old accountant from Dallas, had been his mother's primary caregiver for 2 years since her diagnosis, and the stress was taking a toll on his physical and emotional health. His siblings lived far away and provided little help, leaving Mark feeling isolated and overwhelmed. When his mother's condition worsened and she required round-the-clock care, Mark was desperate for emotional support and understanding from someone who could relate to his situation. That's when he met Sarah Mitchell on a caregiver support forum, who claimed to be a 48-year-old woman from Seattle caring for her father with dementia. Sarah's posts were insightful and compassionate, demonstrating a deep understanding of the challenges faced by adult children caring for parents with memory loss. She shared practical advice about managing difficult behaviors, finding respite care, and coping with the emotional toll of watching a parent's mind deteriorate. Sarah seemed to understand exactly what Mark was going through, and their private messages quickly evolved into a deep emotional connection. Sarah's approach was perfectly designed to appeal to Mark's specific situation as an overwhelmed caregiver. She shared stories about her father's good days and bad days, the frustration of dealing with insurance companies, and the guilt of sometimes resenting the burden of caregiving. Sarah offered emotional support during Mark's most difficult moments, such as when his mother didn't recognize him or when she became agitated and difficult to manage. She provided practical resources for Alzheimer's care and seemed genuinely invested in helping Mark navigate his caregiving journey. Their relationship developed over months of daily conversations about their caregiving challenges, their fears about their parents' declining health, and their dreams of finding someone who understood their unique circumstances. Sarah was patient and understanding when Mark had to cancel planned phone calls due to his mother's needs or medical emergencies. She shared caregiving tips and resources and made Mark feel like he wasn't alone in his struggle. Sarah talked about her own financial struggles due to her father's medical expenses and her reduced work hours to provide care. The crisis began when Sarah contacted Mark in panic, explaining that her father had fallen and broken his hip, requiring emergency surgery and extended rehabilitation. Sarah's insurance wouldn't cover the full cost of the specialized care facility her father needed, and she was facing a $20,000 shortfall. She had exhausted her savings on her father's previous medical expenses and was desperate to ensure he received the care he needed to recover. Sarah was too proud to ask for help directly, but Mark could hear her desperation during their phone conversations as she talked about the possibility of having to put her father in a substandard facility. Mark's understanding of caregiving responsibilities and his empathy for Sarah's situation compelled him to help. He offered to lend Sarah the money she needed for her father's care, viewing it as one caregiver helping another in a time of desperate need. Sarah initially refused, saying she couldn't accept such a large amount from someone she hadn't met in person, but Mark insisted. He took out a personal loan for $20,000 to help what he believed was a fellow caregiver facing an impossible situation. The medical expenses continued to escalate after her father's surgery. Sarah's father developed complications that required additional procedures, specialized medications, and extended physical therapy. The insurance company was denying claims, and Sarah needed money for legal fees to fight the denials. Each request came with medical documents that appeared authentic and heart-wrenching updates about her father's condition and her own emotional exhaustion. Mark sent increasingly large amounts of money, totaling over $65,000 over 5 months, refinancing his home to help what he believed was a fellow caregiver in crisis. The deception began to unravel when Mark suggested that he and Sarah meet in person to provide mutual support during their caregiving journeys. Sarah provided various excuses about being too busy with her father's care or living too far away to meet, but she couldn't maintain the facade of their relationship. When Mark hired a private investigator to verify Sarah's story, he discovered that her photos had been stolen from a caregiver blog, and none of the medical facilities she claimed to be using had any record of her or her father. Mark realized that his compassion as a caregiver had been weaponized against him by criminals who understood exactly how to exploit the isolation and desperation of people caring for elderly parents. The betrayal was particularly cruel because it came during a time when he was already emotionally vulnerable and struggling with his mother's deteriorating condition. He lost his home and had to move his mother to a less expensive care facility. However, Mark used his experience to warn other caregivers about support forum scams and the importance of verifying the identity of people offering help during difficult times. Linda's encounter with romance fraud began when she was rebuilding her life after escaping an abusive marriage. Linda, a 45-year-old nurse from Phoenix, had finally found the courage to leave her violent husband after 20 years of physical and emotional abuse. She was living in a small apartment with her 2 teenage children, working overtime shifts to make ends meet, and slowly rebuilding her confidence and sense of self-worth. When her therapist suggested that she might eventually be ready to consider dating again, Linda was terrified but also hopeful about the possibility of finding a healthy, loving relationship. That's when she met James Parker on a dating app specifically designed for people seeking serious relationships. James claimed to be a 50-year-old widowed firefighter from Denver who had lost his wife in a car accident 3 years earlier. His profile emphasized his commitment to helping others and his desire to find a woman who had overcome adversity and appreciated the value of a stable, loving relationship. James's messages were gentle and respectful, never pressuring Linda for personal information or pushing her to move faster than she was comfortable with in their relationship. James's approach was masterfully crafted to appeal to Linda's specific needs as a domestic abuse survivor. He emphasized his commitment to treating women with respect and kindness, sharing stories about his work as a firefighter helping people in crisis. James spoke about his own experience with loss and healing, making Linda feel like he could understand her journey of recovery from trauma. He was patient with her boundaries and never made her feel pressured or uncomfortable, which was a stark contrast to her experience with her abusive ex-husband. Their relationship developed slowly over months of careful conversation, with James consistently demonstrating respect for Linda's pace and boundaries. He shared stories about his late wife and his grief journey, his work as a firefighter, and his dreams of finding love again with someone who appreciated the importance of trust and safety in a relationship. James sent Linda flowers on difficult days and offered emotional support when she had to deal with court proceedings related to her divorce and custody arrangements. He made her feel valued and protected for the first time in years. The crisis began when James contacted Linda in distress, explaining that he had been injured in a fire rescue and was facing medical bills that his insurance wouldn't fully cover. James had been trying to save a family trapped in a house fire when part of the roof collapsed on him, resulting in serious injuries that required surgery and extensive physical therapy. He was too proud to ask for help, but he was worried about losing his home if he couldn't keep up with his medical expenses and mortgage payments while he was unable to work. Linda's nursing background made her acutely aware of the financial devastation that medical emergencies could cause, and her own experience with trauma made her want to help someone who had dedicated his life to helping others. She offered to help James with his medical expenses, viewing it as supporting a hero who had been injured while saving lives. Linda started sending money to help with James's medical bills, using her overtime pay and small savings to support the man she had come to love and trust. The medical crisis escalated when James claimed that complications from his injuries required additional surgeries and specialized treatments that weren't covered by his firefighter insurance. He needed money for experimental treatments, home modifications to accommodate his injuries, and legal fees to fight the insurance company's denial of his claims. Each request came with medical documents that appeared authentic and updates about his slow recovery and determination to return to helping others. Linda sent increasingly large amounts of money, totaling over $40,000 over 6 months, taking out personal loans and working extra shifts to support what she believed was a genuine hero facing an unfair situation. The deception began to unravel when Linda offered to visit James in the hospital during his recovery, wanting to provide comfort and support during his difficult healing process. James provided various excuses about not wanting her to see him in his current condition or hospital policies restricting visitors, but he couldn't maintain the facade of his injuries. When Linda contacted the fire department James claimed to work for, they had never heard of him and confirmed that no firefighters matching his description had been injured in recent months. Linda realized that her vulnerability as a domestic abuse survivor had been exploited by criminals who understood exactly how to appeal to someone desperate for safety and genuine love. The betrayal was devastating because it came at a time when she was just beginning to trust again after years of abuse. She had to take on additional debt to repay the loans she had taken to help James, setting back her financial recovery from her divorce. However, Linda found strength in her support group for domestic violence survivors and used her experience to warn other abuse survivors about romance scams that specifically target vulnerable women seeking healthy relationships. These stories show us that scammers are getting more sophisticated, but knowledge is our best defense. Trust your instincts, verify everything independently, and remember, legitimate businesses never pressure you to act immediately. Stay vigilant out there.